I am Captain John Sterling Shaw, and I have been asked to document for you a rapid progression of my life history thus far. This expeditious record of my life will be the basis for many subsequent stories I will relate to you of my adventures. I was born on March 10th, 1822, above the trading firm of my family's business, Shaw and Machette, in St. Charles, Missouri. My father died when I was but 1 year old, and my beloved mother continued on in business with Mr. Charles Machette. When I was 8 years old, my mother married the man whom I would consider my father, the Colonel Ludwell E. Powell. He was a poised and fair man who raised me well and showed me great love. I have attempted throughout my life to emulate him. I received a fair English education as was afforded by the ordinary schools of this country in that day. But early on, I manifested a desire for travel through to those western wilds, and determined that as soon as possible I would gratify it. Come 1840, at the age of 18, I was sent to Liberty, Missouri in Clay County to learn the mercantile business at the firm of Rich, Wilson and Company. I remained there 1 year and then returned to St. Charles, where I engaged as the second clerk on the steamer General Leavenworth. Then in 1842, I began working again in that same capacity on the steamer Mary Tompkins. But sadly to say, over all this time, I had begun to feel my health failing, a deep, overwhelming weakness that invades my world and has plagued me my entire life. So in August of 1842, at the age of 20, I started in the company of William Patterson on a trip across the plains to the Rocky Mountains. With 2 pack horses, we traveled on horseback to Independence, Missouri, which at that time was the starting point for Western traders. There, we joined the trading company of Sibyl and Adams of St. Louis. They had most recently purchased Fort Platte on the junction of the Laramie and the Platte Rivers near the Black Hills. After a long and colorful journey, driving our oxen teams across the plains some 700 miles, our travels ended at Fort Platte in November, some 97 days after leaving St. Charles. Following several weeks at the fort, I was taken by a man named Sigler, one of Sibyl and Adams' traders, to meet with the Brule-Lakota, a most noble band of the Sioux Indians on the White River. There, I would learn the art of fur trade. We traded together among the natives throughout that long and harsh winter. Spring finally came, and in May, I left Fort Platte with an assembly of men and our load of furs from the winter trading. We set out on flatboats down the North Platte River, but at Scotts Bluff we were completely covered by a snowstorm for 3 days full. After many trials consequent to the difficult navigation of the Platte River, we in time arrived at Fort Osage in Jackson County, Missouri. At Fort Osage, I embarked on the good steamer Tobacco Plant for home. Her captain, Henry Beer, recalling our work together on the Mary Tompkins and realizing my interest in learning the river, took me 'neath his wing. He taught me well, and thus, in the spring of 1844, at just 22 years of age, I engaged in piloting that insidious Missouri River. In August of 1844, I purchased a stock of goods and started for the mountains to trade with the Indians. But at the crossing of the Kansas River, I was taken ill and unable to proceed. I disposed of my outfit to the firm of Mallison and Richards of St. Charles, with whom I was traveling, and upon purchasing a canoe from a local Indian, embarked in the company of my dear friend Samuel Machette, who was the son of my mother's business partner. Within 2 days, we had arrived at the mouth of the Kansas River at the Missouri. We took passage there on the steamer Anawam, and in due time arrived safely back in St. Charles. In 1845, I again purchased a stock of Indian goods and started for the Sioux Nation. On this trip, I made a very profitable exchange for furs and peltries. In the good company of John Richards, arrangements were made to build a Mackinaw boat. For you see, between us, we had in all 200 packs, that being some 2,000 robes. With the boat finished and loaded, a crew of 8 traveled down the Platte River, but near Fort Kearny, they were overtaken by the Pawnee and robbed of everything. My robes were insured, but as is often the case, they paid but half of their worth. So following this ill fortune, I concluded to go back to the river. I purchased that steamer tobacco plant and ran her until August of 1847. But when finding it an unprofitable investment, I sold her. Upon balancing my accounts, I found I had enough to winter on. Hence, a new opportunity soon offered itself to me to again ply my hand to the Indian trade. In connection with Major Robert Wilson, the sutler for the Oregon Battalion at Fort Kearny, where my father, Colonel Ludwell Powell, was the commander, I started with a large outfit to meet with the Sioux. I made a very profitable trade and returned to St. Charles in the spring of 1848. For that next year, I engaged in piloting on the river, until that most shining date of 1849, when the gold fever took so many to California. Now, seeing this golden opportunity to provide my wares to those weary gold seekers, I committed myself to departing for California, and there to begin mining the miners. I left Independence, Missouri, the last of July 1849, and in 23 days had reached Fort Laramie. It being too late in the season for an overland trip to those gold regions, I concluded to remain there until spring. Thus, in May of 1850, in the company of Timothy Goodale, we started for California. Our trip proceeded some 400 miles to Fort Bridger, located on Black's Fork of the Green River, where again I was taken ill. But as if a blessing from a curse, never could I have imagined spending such occasion with Mr. Jim Bridger. His adept ability to spin a story made time fly, and we struck quite the bond. During my time there at Fort Bridger, I was also present for the wedding of James Bridger to Mary Little Fawn, the daughter of Shoshone Chief Washakie. And that was quite the grand affair. Upon recovering my health, I ventured to Salt Lake City and remained there until the last part of July. I met with Timothy Goodale at Cannon Valley, and I proceeded on to Sacramento to there gain provisions with which to trade to the emigrants. On August 14th, while I was packing my mules in Sacramento, the great squatter fight was fought on that street and among the very pack mules I was loading. Several of the squatters and city officials were killed, but it is strange to say, I and not one of my mules was touched, although an emigrant just behind the mules was killed. Upon returning to Cannon Valley and disposing of my outfit at a very large profit, I returned to Sacramento and remained there till the 1st of November, and then moved on to San Francisco. In the latter part of that month, I left San Francisco on the screw steamer Columbus, bound for Panama. After 24 days and over 5,000 miles, I reached the mouth of the Chagres River. I there compensated the local tribesmen of Panama to transport me by canoe over the Chagres River to the Gulf of Mexico. From there, I took the good steamer Pacific to New Orleans, and in due time, home to St. Louis. In May of 1851, at 24 years of age, I purchased and commanded the steamboat Saranac. I ran her for a year and then sold out. In 1852, with a large stock of immigrant and Indian goods, I again started for Fort Laramie. I made several more very successful trips, but watching events in my beloved West beginning to turn with a heavy heart, in 1854 I sold out to the American Fur Company and returned back to the States. In October of 1854, I purchased the Garden City, one of the finest steamers of that day. But on just her fourth journey from St. Louis to New Orleans, in January of 1855, at the head of Yellow Bend, she took fire and was burned to the water's edge. That following March of 1855, I bought the steamboat Arabia. I ran her very successfully in the Missouri River trade during that summer, even making one trip as far as to the mouth of the Yellowstone River. For you see, in that year she conveyed United States troops to Fort Pierre. These were the very first troops to be stationed in the Sioux country on the Missouri River. That trip took me away from home nearly 3 months. In March of 1856, while traveling upriver near Lexington, Missouri, I was made aware that some 100 Sharps rifles and 2 cannons were being smuggled on my Arabia, hidden deep out of sight below the deck in crates marked carpenter's tools. Needless to say, this turn of events on the very day of my birth 34 years prior made this quite the memorable day. Though it still being in March of that year, I decided to sell the Arabia to Captains William, Terrell, and Boyd. They promptly ran her into an obstacle and nearly sunk her that same month. And then, a mere 5 months later, they buried her for good in that churning brown water near Parksville, Missouri. But at times, I do feel a wee bit twinge of guilt about the sinking of that great white Arabia. That maybe I should have given Captain Terrell just a few more lessons. There's the smile for those ladies who think I never do. Soon thereafter, in connection with Captain Pierre Choteau, I bought that doomed steamer Clara. She made but one trip to the mouth of the Yellowstone River, transporting government agents and Indian annuity goods. For you see, in those days, that vicious scourge, cholera, had become rampant among the region. So upon returning home, I purchased the interests of Captain Choteau and proceeded to Louisville, Kentucky, where I then built the steamer Twilight, using that cursed machinery from the Clara. I ran the Twilight successfully until 1860, making 2 trips to the Yellowstone with those government agents and Indian annuities. Now, in that same year, on July 24th of 1860, I was wed in holy marriage to Mary Jane Elbert of Lexington, Kentucky, among all of our family and friends. It was an event of considerable pomp and grandeur, enjoyed by all. Truly, a day of joy. By the end of 1860, I had sold the Twilight and built the Robert Campbell Jr. Yes, that very steamer which was burned while in United States government employ. Burned while docked at Milliken's Bend in September of 1863, just above Vicksburg, and there, tragically, causing some 25 lives to be lost. In June of 1864, Mary and I purchased the 90-acre estate of Major George Sibley and Mary Sibley, called ELMA, situated neatly on a hill just 1 mile from St. Charles, Missouri. And it was truly a place of beauty. Orchards and gardens surrounding an Italianate-style home with conveniences unlike any built in that day, even those in St. Louis. So we moved on and we began to improve it. In 1866, at Louisville, I built the steamer Stonewall. I ran her most successfully in the St. Louis and New Orleans trade, till the night of October 27, 1869, during a trip from St. Louis to New Orleans in the command of Captain Thomas W. Scott, being some 125 miles below St. Louis. She was entirely consumed by fire. Struggling there in the blackness, in the freezing cold, some 200 passengers and crew lost their lives by drowning and burning. Though I was not present, still, in the silence of the night, those images, they still haunt me. In 1870, at Brownsville, Pennsylvania, I built the steamer Fontenelle. I ran her in the Missouri, once even as high as Fort Benton. But in 1873, as I turned 51 years of age, that Fontenelle was also burned at Algiers, just opposite of New Orleans. Life-threatening events, river disasters, and fire. Enough seemed enough. I vowed to settle in on our perfect estate at ELMA and spend the rest of my days working safely as a farmer. Oh, but even here, that fire fiend followed me. And on April 8th of 1876, at 10 o'clock at night, our dwelling house at ELMA was completely consumed by fire. Now, I do feel that having had my fair share of fire in this life, might I possibly escape that element in the hereafter. So since 1873, I have made myself content to raise my racehorses and to stay in just one place. I remain quietly at home, striving desperately to keep myself from burning up.